let's hope immortality doesn't take 200 years to fully be accepted. Otherwise, there's going to be a lot of people who die in the next 200 years who don't need to. But let's believe that it's accelerated and increasing. But when we get these challenges, we must not allow it to rock our trust in God's goodness in it. And even though we don't understand, we just have to accept, actually, we're still in transition and process, and therefore everything isn't as it will once eventually be.
I'm going to some different churches now, seeing old friends, that I haven't seen that much of. So yesterday I went to the most recent church, and there was a very young man preaching, and he had traveled a bit on the road toward grace,
Yeah.
Great grace, complete grace, and but he preached about Galatians and Romans, and he talked quite a lot about walking in the Spirit. And because I haven't read Galatians for a while, so and I haven't really been thinking about what that really means. So I was going to ask you, if you can, how would you explain it? I mean, what is it to walk in the Spirit?
Okay. Well, I mean, it has different levels of meaning. Obviously, from a general Christian perspective, walking in the Spirit would be more synonymous with being guided by the Spirit or being led by the Spirit. So it would be like walking in relationship with the Spirit. And I think there's an element of that which is, good. And it's at one level. But obviously, there are other meanings. I mean, John obviously talked about being in the Spirit on the Lord's Day, and therefore seeing into heaven and going into heaven. So, from that perspective, there's a sense where walking in the Spirit, being in the Spirit, what does it really mean? And I would say, you could say walking in the Spirit could have a meaning of walking in the Spirit realm, walking in the realm of the Spirit, walking in spiritual realms. Now, obviously, the context of every verse which talks about it will give you some understanding of what it's engaging, but of course, we know it's translated in that way by people who probably didn't have a mystic view of God or what can be possible. So they wouldn't have even thought about the fact that we could actually walk in spiritual realms. So we're in the Spirit, rather than it meaning, well, we're in the Holy Spirit. When John said he was in the Spirit, he didn't say capital S, because there was no capital S in Greek. So he said, I'm in the Spirit. I was in the Spirit. So where was he? What was he? Was he engaging with his Spirit? Was he engaging in the Spirit realm? That's why he could see, and that's why he could enter in. All sorts of different ways of looking at it. And I think people would describe it differently depending on where they're coming from theologically. And they would have no concept of actually being in the Spirit realm or being able to engage your spirit in the Spirit realm. Coming from a more evangelical perspective, they would just think of, walking in the Spirit was walking in the Holy Spirit's guidance, or walking, if you're more charismatic, you could maybe put that context to walking in the gifts of the Spirit. Which would mean living, rather than walking as a term of actual physical walking. It would be our walk, which is synonymous with our Christian life. So our Christian walk can be lived in the Spirit. And that's how I would sort of look at it. I live in the realm of the Spirit continually, and my spirit is active in that realm. But I'm also walking here connected to my spirit being seated in that realm. So we're seated with Christ in heavenly places. You could say that is in the spirit, in the spiritual position of sonship that I am in the heavenly realms where I'm seated. So there's so many different ways you can look at a little phrase, and everyone is going to look at that phrase, walking in the spirit, and have a different perspective depending on how they frame their life and what they're believing and how they live. So an evangelical would have a different perspective of what walking in the spirit meant to a charismatic, perhaps, or a reformed person. You know, they would have different views of what that meant, and the possibilities that exist for walking in the spirit would be limited by their own theological system of belief. And the more you progress into a level of relationship with God and intimacy with God, the more possibilities open up for what being in the spirit, walking in the spirit, living in the spirit actually means. Now, for me now, it means that we are multidimensional, living in spiritual realms and able to be in multiple places in the spirit. So I'm walking out my destiny, both on earth and in the realms of heaven and beyond, in the spirit. And that being in the spirit in that realm enables me to walk in the spirit in this realm, because I'm me. You know, I might be functioning in different places or different roles, whatever, but I'm still me. So I'm still integrated in one sense as a whole being. So whatever my spirit is doing is affecting whatever I'm doing here in this realm. And if I am extending the boundaries of my spirit around myself so that rivers of living water are flowing, the energy of life, God's life, spirit is around me, then that also could be seen as walking in the spirit, because I'm walking in a realm that I've created around myself, where rivers of living water are flowing through me, creating an energy field of life around me. That could be seen as walking in the spirit. But that would have no, people really would have no idea about that if they're coming from a non-mystical view of life. But, you know, that's how I live every day. I'm generating an energy field of life, which I would say is spirit, living water around me, so I can walk in that while I'm here on earth and live consciously aware of God's presence, of me in relationship with God in everyday life. You know.
Wow. I thought when I read it, you know, I thought, yeah, living from the spirit, and then, and you know, from the inside out instead of the opposite. Because I thought my spirit is now complete in Him. You know, in my new identity, my spirit is complete. So if I live out of that there I have everything, you know, that I need, everything I need in that place. So I live from that instead of, you know, the other way around. But what you said is much more.
It's much more. Yeah. I mean, Galatians 5:16, yeah, if I walk by the spirit, you'll not carry out the desire of the flesh.
Yeah.
That can be seen in quite a negative perspective, in that walking in the spirit is, you know, sort of linked to, well, the spirit and the soul are not together. So in this instance, you're seeing the desire of the flesh is opposed to the desire of the spirit. And you got that thing about the spirit wrestling against the flesh, but that's from a person talking that's not surrendered and become one and whole. And then your soul is not separated or in any way distanced from your spirit. or guided or directed by your spirit with the Holy Spirit, because if we're joined to the Lord, it says we're one spirit with him. You know, so that again would be a different way of connecting. So the context of Galatians 15:16, you know, is really Paul looking at the life lived of a person who's not fully mature. And so they're struggling. And he's talking in the context there of biting and devouring one another and consuming one another, which is not how obviously believers should be. And he's contrasting it with the statement of love your neighbor as yourself. So they obviously had issues in Galatia where people were in antagonistic to one another, angry, unforgiving, looking to hurt each other. Well, he's basically saying, well, that's totally contradictory to what Jesus told us to do, love one another. And actually, if you're walking in the Spirit, you wouldn't be that way. So effectively, you're not actually operating out of the spiritual life that's in you. You're operating out of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So you're following your own way and not actually being led by the Spirit. Because later on it says, if we live by the Spirit, let's follow the Spirit as well. In the same passage. And he also talks about, in the same passage, the fruit of the Spirit. So he's trying to contrast, here's the deeds of the flesh, in other words, our life, which is not lived in from the tree of life. So if we're going to operate independently of God, even as believers, because he's talking to believers here, he's not just talking about anybody. So he's talking about even believers, if they choose to do their own thing and follow their own path, are going to operate outside of what God is like. So he sort of is expressing that. For the desire of the flesh is against the Spirit against the flesh. Now, he's not really talking about the body or the soul per se, but the soul in alignment with independence. Because the soul and spirit and body in union and oneness with one another, with God, obviously is going to be exhibiting the fruit of the Spirit, not of independence. And what we've got to be careful of here is actually thinking that what Paul is saying is that actually your body and your soul is bad. He's not saying they're bad. He's just saying if you choose to align them with something which is contradictory to what the Spirit would lead you into, or contradictory to God's heart for us, then we're going to exhibit characteristics that are not in alignment with who God is and who we really are. So our identity will be coming out of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil in independence from God, rather than our identity coming from being made in the likeness and image of God. So you have a whole thing. Now, then it goes on to say, those who belong to Christ have crucified the flesh with its passions and desires. In other words, if you know that you're in Christ, you know you died with him, were buried with him, and were resurrected with him. And now you're not going to live in a life which is independent in that way, because you have recognized that you have died with him. Therefore, you're no longer that person anymore. So Romans 6 talks about, 5 and 6 talks about there, reckon yourself dead. But what it means is come into agreement of the fact that you died with Christ, were baptized into his death, burial, and resurrection, which is Romans 6:3. So that gives you a sort of Paul here really sort of saying, look, if you walk independently of God, you're going to outwork things which are not going to be an expression of God. But if you walk in the Spirit, then you're going to do those things, because you're living not your old life. So go back to Galatians where it says, I have been crucified with Christ. It's no longer I who live. And if you look at that verse, which sort of is expressing what has already happened in reality, but what we need to do then is to live in that. He then sort of presents some things there. You know, I have been crucified with Christ. It's no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. The life I now live in the flesh. So he's not saying that we're not living in a physical body with a soul. He's basically saying, if I choose to live that life independent of God, there's going to be one outworking. If I choose to live because I reckon that I have been crucified with Christ, and I don't, that old way of living, following my own independence, is no longer living. That's no longer the life I live. You know, and then he goes on to say, you know, the life that I now live in the flesh, I live by the faith of the Son of God who loved me and gave himself up for me. So my whole life is lived coming out of what God believes about me, and the faith or the belief that God has in me empowers me to live that way. So when I know how God sees me, that empowers me to live the way he sees me and not the way I see myself or other people might see me. You know, so that has a completely different perspective to that, which I think is really, really important to realize that it's about who we come into agreement with, which is the whole word metanoia, you know, which is wrongly translated repentance, is agreeing with God's mind will change my mind, renew my mind, so I won't be conformed to the pattern of the world, because I'm walking in the Spirit, in relationship with the Spirit, and in that way I'm outworking the reality of who God sees me to be rather than anything else. So I think there's quite a lot, you know, when you're looking at the phrase and the meaning and the deeper meanings and the reality of how we're supposed to live in relationship with God, being one spirit with him. But you have to be joined to the Lord to be one spirit with him, you know, and that is the surrendering of my independence. You can't be joined unless you give up your independence, which is what marriage is. You leave your single state and you enter into a marriage state. You can't carry on being single because that attitude will cause you not to be able to be joined. So in our relationship with God, to be joined with him means you give up your right to independence and you choose to become one with him. And from becoming one with him, you're one spirit, no longer separated, but become one. Now, that doesn't mean we become God, but we become joined in a relationship with God, which is in intimacy, oneness of heart and mind and purpose, which expresses that relationship. So it's quite interesting. You can read a phrase and you can read it in context. And then when you look at the context of where it's written, you're going to get even a different understanding, a more correct understanding, and then linking it to the rest of things that were written in that letter, you're going to see a flow that goes right through the letter. Part of the problem is a lot of evangelicals take one verse and they create a theology, an understanding of that verse without looking at the context of the verse in a chapter, because there was no chapters and there were no verses. It was a letter. Or in the book as a whole. You know, when a letter's written, the letter was written to present something right through the letter. And unless you look at the themes and thoughts of the whole letter, you can take one bit of the letter and get it completely out of context, which is, I think, what happens a lot of the time when people read a verse and they just take that verse and make it mean what they think they want it to mean, without taking into context what it meant to the people who are listening to it, the person who wrote it, and the context of the immediate stuff that in this instance Paul was writing about.
But this that you said, giving up our independence, becoming joined with his spirit, becoming one spirit with him. In my life, I feel it's like a process. I mean, I feel it, or maybe it's just that I'm not there yet, but I just feel it's like, sometimes I just forget about it. And I continue trying to do things in my own strength, and I forget that he is there to help me, really, and to guide me. So, what does that mean?
Well, it is, of course, a journey. It's not an instant thing. What Jesus has done is complete, but our coming into the reality of that requires a renewal of our mind to come into agreement with it, and therefore the way of thinking we used to have no longer rules our life. That requires a number of choices. It's not just going to be, because people say, I made Jesus Lord of my life. And it's like, okay, what about this area? What about that area? Oh, I didn't think of that. Yeah, because they do it to the level of revelation understanding they had at the time. But God will always call you deeper. So it requires ongoing surrenders at deeper levels as God calls you to it. But he's leading you along that journey to the place where ultimately you live in a state of being which is constantly aware of his presence, but without the, I've got to think about this, I've got to do. You're just being that, in reality who you are, who he is, and you live in that conscious awareness. It's a state of conscious awareness of God, which doesn't require me to be talking to him every minute, because I'm aware he's sharing his heart with me. He's revealing himself to me in different ways, and that becomes sort of the relationship we have with him, in which we're joined. But I can be joined at one level, and then he shows me an area that needs to become joined at another level. And ultimately, for me, I entered the dark cloud in 2011-12 to come to the point where I gave up independence, and I gave up my right or desire to, in a sense, create my own identity from what I was doing, and even doing the good things and the right things. But it was still me doing it. And there was a mixture in my heart which enabled me to do that and maintain my soul's control over the situation. And actually, I got to the point where, okay, I can't do this like this anymore. God wants to take me deeper. I have to let go of the control of me needing to know what God was doing to trust him. So for me, it became a trust issue. I trust you totally, therefore I don't need to sort out my own stuff anymore. I don't need to choose to do things which are going to keep me safe. I don't need to know everything, because I trust that you know what there is to know, and you'll let me know what I need to know. So it changed my whole perspective in my soul's position. And therefore, the connection my soul had to my spirit was from the outside in. And then when God cut that connection and severed this connection between my soul to my spirit, he reconnected me from my spirit to my soul. And I became one whole in a completely different way. Now, that didn't mean that there wasn't more work to do in deconstructing my thinking and renewing my mind. There was a lot of work to do, but the principle was set. I was not any longer in control of this process. And I trusted him to lead me and do in my life everything he needed to do whenever he needed to do it. And I kept my hands off it. I just kept agreeing with him. I let him set the agenda and the pace and the direction of the journey. And I trusted that he knew and knows the best. So if when I didn't understand, I didn't understand. That was it. It didn't stop me trusting in him, because I know he understands. And I don't need to understand most of the time. And there are times when I would like to understand certain things, and it ends up I don't, and I can't. But what do I do with that? I trust him. Yeah, and recently there have been 3 or 4 things that have happened around me, and a few of them, I don't understand why they happened. And there were a number of people who died, who were quite close to me recently. And I don't know why they died, because they were following God, engaging heaven, believed in immortality, but they died. And people were praying, and people were ascending, and people were doing everything for them. Chris Carter, Anna Wingate, they were both close, and I'd spent a lot of time with them, and I don't know why they died. Now, people postulate. I'm not going to make any hypothesis about why, but what I do know is God is still a good God, and I still trust him, even when I don't understand. So those 2 people got me questioning, and it was quite hard, because I've been talking about immortality, and within the Patreon group, even last night, I did a whole first session on immortality in relation to unconditional love. And immortality and the belief in immortality is being challenged. And I didn't allow it to change my belief in immortality, but it still has questions. Well, why? But I trust God, so I don't know. He hasn't told me, so I don't know. And I have to accept that. And in the same week as both those friends died, my mum died. And she was 91, and she was bedridden, and she hadn't got over COVID recently, and therefore I understood that she was coming to the end of her life. And, she didn't have the same belief. She believed in healing, but she didn't have the same belief in one sense. And she'd had Alzheimer's, and so she was not really able to cognitively engage herself to believe for healing. And therefore, I engaged with God, and I asked God, about it, and is there anything I can do? And he basically, gave me that peace that she was going to be a place of rest. And since then I've met all of them in the realms of heaven, with the cloud of witnesses, and I'm obviously rejoicing where they are, and in their ongoing outworking of their destiny, in that realm. But it still doesn't answer the question. And there are some people who that would cause major issues to, because they believe in immortality, and then, well, so did these, and they died. So that would rock their faith, if you like, in that belief. But it didn't mine, because my belief in immortality is not what makes me immortal. It's what Jesus has done, and it's the life that I live in him, and the living from his life, and the living water that's flowing from my innermost being, which actually is what energizes me to live in abundance. So I'm not trusting in what I believe in. I'm trusting in God, who is faithful. And when it comes to situations like that, I just have to say, Father, I don't understand, but I trust you. And that's not an answer that some people want. Obviously, they want the black and white answer. Well, why? And not being in the shoes of the person who died, I don't know what was in their head or in their heart, or what they were going through. I can't say. And therefore, how could I possibly give an answer unless God gave me 100% the answer? And he hasn't. So, as in a lot of things, this is where our trust in God's goodness and his love comes in. And then you believe God will still bring something good out of a situation that you don't want. I mean, I was believing and hoping, and my intention was to come into agreement with those 2 people for their healing and wholeness and restoration. That was my desire. Can I say hand on heart that God told me that would be the case? No, I can't, because he didn't. But I actually believe that the compassion that I carry, and the desire for healing and health that I carry for friends, you know, I can release that intention. But along with everyone else who was releasing that intention didn't stop them dying. Now, I could say that, oh, well, I perhaps shouldn't have that intention because they died anyway. But actually, no, because my desire, they wouldn't die. But they did. I have to accept that reality. And then I have to trust that God knows better than I do. You know, and sometimes that's hard, you know, and particularly for some people who really like to know, you know, black and white categoric answers, it's very hard. But I'm legislating that it does not affect people's trust in God or belief in immortality, because not some people have died, you know, and obviously right throughout history people have died. So there's a lot of evidence stacked up on the death side, you know, but we need to see the evidence stacked up on the life side is the nature of God himself, you know, but we have to come into that reality, and we have to come into the reality to live in that reality, not just to hope for that reality, which is why believing in immortality is not enough just to say, well, I believe in immortality. How do you put on immortality? Because it says that, let the mortal put on the immortal. So how do we clothe ourselves? How do we receive the energy that enables us to live in immortality? Because it's a big subject, you know, and Jesus obviously said, you know, in John 6, you won't, if you eat my flesh, drink my blood, you won't die. So he linked it to what he was later going to reveal through communion of his body and his blood and his death. So, of course, it says in Peter that Jesus not only took our sin, but our sickness on the cross. So he died so we don't have to die, because he's abolished death. And 2 Timothy 1:10 says that he's abolished death and brought life and immortality to light through the gospel. But for a lot of people, they still have a covenant with death. They still believe that death is actually what's going to promote them to heaven and will remove all the problems that they have in this life when they die. So they're expecting death, and they see death as a good thing, really, which is, I don't. You know, I don't actually see that death is a good thing at all, because it's totally contradictory to the nature of God himself, who's abundance. And Jesus promised us abundant life. Who causes death? Not God. The enemy comes to rob, kill, and destroy. God wants us to have and live in abundant life. So it's a subject that I believe is on the heart of God to reveal in our time and for people to embrace, but that subject is being contended with. You know, you're all the way through. Whenever someone has revelation, that revelation has to be stood upon. Like when people got revelation of being baptized in the Spirit and spiritual gifts, you know, it took a generation or so before that was recognized widely amongst normal sort of churches. And along the way, those people who were believing in that, you know, obviously you had the Pentecostal side of it, and then eventually the charismatic side of it. Those people were often treated with suspicion or, you know, as heretics or whatever else, you know. So sometimes you have to be able to stand firm in spite of the opposition that there is, you know. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Okay. Well, we've got Stella there, and then we'll go to Tish. Okay, Stella.
Hi. Oh, thank you so much for clarifying that issue about immortality and all that has happened recently. Was it really was rocking my world, and I was thinking, who is going to give us an answer? And like you're saying, why? And you can't answer that. And in the same breath, I wanted you've answered most of the questions of you don't know why. And then I would want to go further and say, so why is right now we are engaging him in the heavens or face to face, that he is still not revealing certain things? Is it not the time? Is it because we are not mature enough? We have to mature to a certain degree for us to, for him to reveal certain things, like the question of why, because all the restoration of all things, the main hook of it is restoring, is immortality. For me, that's how I understand it. Immortality is what will make everything, the intention of what he was doing, go back to their original intent. So if then we are experiencing this and having our world rocked like this, because it really, really rocked when this happened, and still rocking, and we're still asking the question why. And thank you for that answer. So then why is he not giving us a glimpse or an understanding? I don't know. You might not have the answer. I have to put it out there.
Yeah.
Because we've been through this recently now. And we have to have something really, because the world is really against us when we come up with something like this. And now we can see that. But then we still need to have a way of then saying, we don't understand. The world will not take that answer lightly. I don't know. You know what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I mean, there may well be a degree where particularly our maturity is not so much that we aren't mature enough to God to reveal something. We're probably just not mature enough to understand it. So I don't think God's wanting to hold things back from us, but I remember him saying things over years to me I still didn't understand. So he said it, I journaled it, I didn't understand it. But later, I got to a place where I did understand it. Now I look back at my journals and thought, wow, he was telling me this years ago, but I didn't understand it then. Well, what changed? Me. I changed in that I was able to understand it because I had matured to the level where I could actually hear what God was saying and understand what he was saying in that way. Now, that's not to say that God will tell us everything. There are some things I don't need to know. But in those situations, that's when I choose to trust, when I don't know. What I know is that God will bring good out of every situation, even if it wasn't his intention that those things happened. God will bring good out of it. So I'm looking for the good that will come out of these situations, which might be to highlight in people that they don't understand immortality and they don't believe it. They might want to believe it or hope that it's true, but have they literally been able to put on immortality? Probably not. So then that gives us an opportunity of opening the door to be able to bring more revelation about immortality and what it is to put it on and how to live in it and how to do it. And I would say most people who say they believe in immortality are still tethered to death in some way in their thinking or their expectation, either to time and its inevitable passage to age and death, or to death itself as a programmed thing that everyone's going to die, which is both cultural and also religious. And I think a lot of mindsets you don't realize are there until something begins to shock. See, I wasn't rocked by what happened. I wasn't rocked because A, I still trust God's goodness, and B, because I still believe in immortality, and this has not rocked my belief in that reality, because my reality is my experience. But I didn't get to immortality without having to go through healing and health. I couldn't jump from one situation. And some people who are sick, to jump to the reality of, well, I'm immortal, is a huge jump. They need to get healed and then live in health. So then if you live in health, the inevitable consequence of living in continual health is you won't die. So there's a sort of process and journey to get there. And when people start talking about immortality, and it starts to get preached and it starts to get shared, and people like Nancy and Justin and others who are sharing it, people can't jump from having no understanding or belief in immortality at all to, oh yeah, I'm immortal. It might be true, but actually, where's the outworking of that in their lives? Because if they're still sick, well, then immortality is in conflict with the sickness. So they need to get healed. And then they need to stay in healing and live in health. Because a lot of people say they believe in something, but they haven't got any experience of it in their own lives. And so I would say healing and health are the first two steps towards living in immortality. And if you haven't expressed that, how are you going to be able to say, well, I have immortal life, when you're still needing healing all the time? You know, so we've got to move away from where we are to where God wants us to be. And that's often a journey in the process. And for me, it took years to get from believing in healing, because I was brought up not to believe in healing. You know, it's like, well, God could heal, but no one ever got healed. And he always added, well, if he wills, you know. So, you know, the Brethren Church didn't believe in gifts of healing, but they would pray for people who were sick, not laying hands on them, but praying. But they would always add, if it be your will, Lord, because they were never sure it was God's will. So they added that bit in the end just to cover their bases. So if someone didn't get well, then they assumed, well, it must have been God's will that they died because they didn't get well. So, you know, there was all this sort of thing going on. And then when I sort of got baptized in the Spirit, I began to realize that there were gifts of healing. And then I experienced gifts of healing, you know, and I got healed in different ways. Sometimes people prayed for me, laid hands on me, and I got an instant miracle. Once I was so laughing in the Spirit, totally inebriated and totally drunk in the Spirit, I slid down the wall, fell on the floor, and got up healed because my back was really bad and I couldn't lie down. If I lay down, I was in too much pain, so I couldn't sleep lying down. I had to sit up. But I slid down the wall, laughing, completely laughing my head off, got on the floor, and got up healed. Now, there's no rhyme or reason to that. They weren't even asking about healing, because I didn't have, even then, I didn't really think about it. But I got healed. And then I got healed through people laying hands on me, praying for me. And then I got diagnosed with Meniere's disease, and I got everyone to pray for me, and none of it changed. And I wasn't healed by people praying for me, because God had an intention of using what happened and bringing good out of it, even though he didn't want me to have Meniere's disease, but he wanted me to know what true healing was, and then health. So I went back to the basics, because I believed healing was in God's kingdom. You know, because it was a kingdom vineyard theology that I had been taught. So then when I looked for myself, and it took me 2 or 3 years of going back into that myself, I realized that no, healing is in the atonement. Jesus died so I didn't have to be sick. He took my sickness in his body, as well as my sin, my lost identity in his body, and he overcame that death with life. So that changed everything. And then I discovered one of the names of God was the Lord who heals. My dad was the healer. And so I accepted that, got healed after a period, because I knew that was true. And then the healing came. And then that progressed into health. Of, no, my inheritance is not just to get healed from sickness. My inheritance is not to get sick in the first place. So to live in health. And then I had to learn how to live in health. which isn't living by presumption. Oh, well, if anything happens to me, I'll get healed. No, it's actually, I need to look after myself. I need to live in a healthy style, a lifestyle. Therefore, I need to manage how I eat and what I do in my life, because I have to cooperate with health. I can't just sort of say, well, I'm living in health and I'm obese and sick and eating all the wrong things and not getting enough sleep and, you know, doing all that. That isn't a healthy lifestyle. So I adopted a healthy lifestyle, which then contributed to the health I was living in. And then eventually, when I realized that I can choose the reality of my life, and I began to realize that, you know, being in health meant I didn't have to die, then that then took me into, oh, yeah, of course it doesn't. Because if I've got no sickness in me, but then I took the revelation of communion of what Jesus said, if you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you won't die. So that linked the two together then of, well, I'm living in a healthy way and I'm not sick, but actually I'm taking on the life of God to maintain that state. It's his life that enables me not to die. It's not my life. It's not me generating my own immortality. I'm living in his life. Now that changed everything then, because I began to understand the level of intimacy and relationship and being one, me, spirit, soul, and body, with Father, Son, and Spirit, that enabled me to live with that mindset and consciousness of immortality. You know, but it took time to get there. So my healing and health have been for 37 years. Immortality, the consequence of seeing that from an immortal state, it's probably been only the last maybe 5-10 years, or certainly the last 5 years in a consistent way of this is what this really means. But my embracing communion, the life of God, through taking on the life of Jesus and having rivers of living water flowing from my innermost being, of drawing from the fountain of life, which is in me, meant the source of that life is flowing in me. I'm not trying to get it from outside somewhere. It's already in me. I just have to see that flowing in me, activated me and energized in me. So I come into agreement with that life in me. You know, I'm not searching for a fountain of youth or the elixir of life or something. You know, it's in me already. I have life in me. I am going to come into agreement with that life. And that is what's going to create within me limitless energy and abundant life, which is not me doing it. It's me receiving it from the source of life himself. So I'm drinking from that source. Therefore, communion became less me taking communion every day and making declarations about communion and what it was doing in my cells and DNA and everything else, and eradicating death from my history, to actually realizing that I live in the abundance of this life and I am in communion. I don't take communion, I live in communion. It is a conscious state of being. I am in communion with Father, Son, and Spirit. I am in co-union, if you like. So their life is my life. But that's a totally different mindset. You know, it took a while to get there. You know, and I didn't know why I was doing it, how I was doing it. I just chose that reality because that was my intention and it was the Father's heart. When I was living in that state of communion, he then showed me how it worked. So then he unveiled the mechanics behind how rivers of living water from my innermost being. Where was my innermost being? I assumed it was my spirit, but actually it isn't my spirit. It's where my spirit, soul, and body are co-joined in union and communion. where the Merkaba is within the core of my being, that is the point of connection between spirit, soul, and body, and with heaven, and with every other dimensional reality. And then my energy gates, which are energized from that life, which is flowing into the core of my being. So I have streams of energy flowing to energize my whole being. Well, I didn't know that's how it worked until the Father took me on the journey to discover where the river of life went. Within me. I knew where it was in heaven, and I've bathed in it and been up the waterfalls and all that stuff. But actually, no, it's a fountain, a source in me. I need to drink from that source. That source needs to become a flow of energy, of life, of spirit within me. And then I can embrace how I can cooperate with that consciously to then begin to live in a conscious reality that I am energized, that I have limitless life and energy within me daily. So I'm never going to run out of any resource of anything I need, because I'm energized, and that's just basically the quantity of life. Then that moves on to the quality of immortal life, which is, who I really am, and that takes you into multi-dimensional, non-linear, being unrestricted by time, space, and living as God intended Adam to have lived if he had continued to follow that path into ascension and maturity in sonship. Yeah, Tish, you got your hand up there. You just got to unmute. You're muted.
Thank you so much for the explanation on health,
Yeah.
because that was one of the things I was going to ask you about, the health and its connection to immortality. I honestly don't understand immortality. I try to avoid it very much because I just feel like I am not there yet. And the reason being that I feel like I myself have to learn a lot and unlearn a lot in connection to health. So you actually explained that very well. Thank you very much. Okay. The other thing with Christopher Carter was I was devastated when I heard that he was ill. And I remember posting it on the prayer intention on my Facebook. But I sent messages to Gail and Steve, wanting to understand how long, if he knew he was ill, and if that has been his body for a while, and what has been done about it. I've had them talk back to me. Explain a few things to me, which settled me, but unsettled me at the same time. And I remember one night I was so worried. I wasn't worried. I was shaking. I like the word Stella used. I was really shaking. And I sat, and that's not to say that many people are not dying. A lot of people are dying, but I'm talking about forerunners. So I sat in my living room in the evening, and I couldn't move. I couldn't pray. The telly was on. There was rubbish series going on, but my spirit was engaging Father up to like 2 a.m. or after. And I slowly went up to bed, and I knew that in my sleeping stage, I was still asking questions, and I couldn't pray because I didn't know what to pray for. I knew what the intention was, but I kept saying, Father, what is your intention? I want to know what you are saying regarding this. So that was the focus of my communication with Father. And in my dream state, I saw a huge plantain, a bunch of plantains. So it looked like a bunch of banana on a tree. Oh. 3 green bananas were marked. 3 were marked. And I woke up from the sleep, and I thought, what was that? But the understanding I got was 3 people were being plucked, even though they were not ripe. Yeah. That really shook me more. So I kept asking Father, why? How do we pray about that? Can we stop it? Is this your intention? Why would that happen? Do you need them up there? So these were some of the questions I was asking. However, from that day, that was a few days before Christopher died, I couldn't pray according to the intention that I posted on Facebook anymore. I started asking for Father's will to be done in his life. And when I started praying like that, I was at peace. But what was unsettling me was that he has young children. And why Father would plug him at a time, this time with young children, was another thing that I couldn't deal with. So I wasn't surprised when the news came, but I was still devastated. And I know you've answered this, but how then do we present the issue of immortality to the world? And if this is Father's intention, how do we make people aware? Because I said to Father, I am not brave enough to tell people that 3 people have been marked. It's too much. This one we can't cope with. You just mentioned another one. So 2 have gone. And how can you say that to the world? So yeah, this is me. And I couldn't even tell my group. I couldn't tell them. I was that devastated.
Well, it's the same thing with everything else. Jesus died on the cross for everybody, but not everyone's come to a realization yet. It doesn't stop us preaching the gospel that Jesus died for everybody and loves everybody. It's not perfectly received yet because people have a choice. So they're not yet in a place where they've come to a realization of what Jesus has done. And it's the same thing. I believe what Jesus did on the cross was to deal with sickness as well as sin, therefore to bring us into our inheritance of health and therefore come into immortality. But a lot of people that have been deceived into believing that actually death is what brings immortality, because they're only thinking in spiritual terms. They're not thinking physical terms. They're only thinking spiritual. Well, yes, I'm immortal. My spirit won't ever die. Yeah, but they're only linking it to that. So every verse they read talking about immortality or death being conquered or death being abolished, they just see, oh, that's spiritual. I'll go to heaven one day. So there's a huge area of unbelief in this area, because it's not saying they don't believe in immortality. It's that they don't believe it's now. They only believe it's future, which is the same eschatological thing, that the future will bring resurrection and judgment, rather than, no, the judgment has already been passed. We're already resurrected. We're already alive. So it's the same deception that puts everything off to the future, which puts immortality off to the future. And then ironically, death brings the revelation of immortality to them. But actually, that's a deception. That's not the truth. But there's a whole swathe of the Christian church who believe that. And of course, the world, most of them, would want to believe in immortality, but they see it coming through some technological advancement where we wouldn't die because, hence they get frozen and their heads frozen in the hope that in the future there'll be some medical advancement that, cryogenics and all this stuff, that eventually they will be healed and cured, which, is pretty desperate, I guess, but that's how some people are. And some people still believe in the fountain of youth or the elixir of youth or eternal youth or whatever. And some people will do rituals to get it. Some people do occult rituals because they want not to die. So there's a whole mixture of stuff in the world, but in the church, I think the church has been conditioned to accept death as promotion. And the only way actually that hardships, toil and labor and stuff in life is going to be removed. Well, that association with death has to be broken if people are going to fully embrace life. Obviously, when people keep dying, it's a challenge to immortality, particularly people who are in the sort of stream of believing in heaven and life and everything else. But I don't know what was going on in Chris's head. I don't know what's going on in Anna's head at the time. you know, I don't know. I'm not in their shoes, so I cannot tell you where they were in their own belief and understanding of that in face of their sickness. And that is where I don't know what level of belief that they were able to maintain, because they were diagnosed and prognosed as you're going to die. It's because I wasn't there, I wasn't with them, I don't know. But I know in my own life, having faced these issues, it doesn't rock my belief in immortality any more than it rocks my belief in salvation for all, or the restoration of all things. But everything is not restored yet. And in the process of everything not being fully restored yet, things aren't actually going to be in alignment with that restoration until they're restored. So it's a journey and a process. And I see that process is ongoing. And along the way, there will be challenges that challenge our belief in that process, which we have to overcome and continue to trust God in spite of the things which seem to be contradictory. Because what does it say? It says that it's through tribulation, when various trials and troubles come, that actually produces change when we overcome it. Now, I would much rather it just happen, but it seems to be that we overcome to come into the reality of something. You know, I was diagnosed with an incurable disease. It wasn't life-threatening, you know, unless I had an attack while I was driving or something, then it could have been. But, you know, it wasn't life-threatening, but it was debilitating. And it meant I had to take medication, which was not pleasant. You know, side effects to the medication, you know, to stop me having violent vertigo attacks. And I was also going deaf and had tinnitus, and there were various associated things that I took the tablets to try and minimize. But that forced me, when I didn't get healed by normal methods, to go back to the first principles where I discovered what Jesus did to bring about healing and abundant life in me, and then the reality of that in my life, which led to health. So God used the situation. Did God give me the sickness to bring about that? No, but he used it to get me to know that God was my healer and he didn't want me to die, you know, eventually, you know. Now, I wasn't talking about immortality 20 years ago or 37 years ago when I first discovered how I could live in health, you know, once I got healed of that disease, you know. So I continued the journey until it eventually led me to its, I think, inevitable consequence. If you live in health and you're embracing the life of God through being in communion with him in life, in the spirit, then ultimately you're not going to die. But that wasn't a conclusion I made when I first got healed. I was just grateful I didn't have to take the tablets anymore. And then I worked through living in health. So I had to take captive the thoughts. I had to deal with the attacks, the testing of that, because it was tested. You know, there were certain things which came on me and I had to get them off me. I didn't accept sickness, but it didn't mean that I wasn't attacked with symptoms that I had to say, no, I reject those symptoms. I'm not receiving those symptoms. They're not mine. So I'm not having them, and they went. But over the first few years, there was a lot of testing in my belief of health. So I was challenged, but I overcame, and I was challenged and I overcame. And eventually they stopped challenging me because they knew it would be pointless. Because all it did, it caused me to go back to closer to God, you know, but not you know, wasn't an instant thing. And I don't think today immortality is just going to be embraced instantly, just like baptism of the Spirit wasn't embraced by the majority of the church instantly. There were some forerunners who had experiences. There were mystic forerunners, obviously, through history. There were obviously those in the 19th century, Maria Woodworth-Etter and Alexander Dowie and others, who were the forerunners introducing the Pentecostal, what we call the Pentecostal music, Azusa Street, sort of stirred that. The Welsh revival initially started to stir belief in something, and then Azusa Street really spread that fire, and then more and more people accepted the Pentecostal side of it, and then eventually that became mainstream in the charismatic renewal. But that was 150 years after initially, like even the Brethren movement experienced gifts of the Spirit back in the 1820s, but they rejected them and ended up teaching that these things are not God and not today. So they developed a theology of cessationism linked to dispensationalism that says, oh, that was only for the early church. But God poured out his Spirit upon them because they wanted to come out of the restriction of Anglicanism. So they found the priesthood of all believers, the reality of that truth, but they rejected what came with it, which was gifts of the Spirit offered them. So all the way from there, so you could talk about 1820, that's virtually 200 years ago. When in modern times, things started to unveil, it's taken 200 years for that to be pretty much accepted across most of the church. Not all of it, but most of it. So, let's hope immortality doesn't take 200 years to fully be accepted. Otherwise, there's going to be a lot of people who die in the next 200 years who don't need to. But let's believe that it's accelerated and increasing. But when we get these challenges, we must not allow it to rock our trust in God's goodness in it. And even though we don't understand, we just have to accept, actually, we're still in transition and process, and therefore everything isn't as it will once eventually be. And along the way, there will be a lot of things we probably don't understand. But if we stand firm and don't allow that to rock us in one sense, I'm not saying we should deny the emotions, because of course those emotions, I was sad and upset and over it. But in one sense, deep down, I knew they were going to die. I just knew it deep down, but I didn't want to, I wouldn't want to be negative. So I was like, I would agree with people to believe in healing, but I didn't really deep down actually think that was going to happen, but I don't, but I was not going to come out and say that, because I think I didn't want to undermine other people who were believing and things. But ultimately, then you come to the point where, okay, that didn't happen. So I have to accept that it didn't happen. And now I'm not going to allow that to influence believing in the future for more and more people to come into the health and wholeness.